Welcome to Thriving with ADHD, a podcast where we'll share everyday practical tips to thrive in life as an adult with ADHD. This podcast is brought to you by Animo Sano Psychiatry, a behavioral health practice with a specialist ADHD clinic based in North Carolina. And this is your host, Nada Pupovac. Welcome to Thriving with ADHD, dear ADHD community. We are back with a new episode, and this time we are talking about ADHD and executive functions with Mackenzie Kirchner, a PA-C at Animo Sano Psychiatry. Stay tuned as we'll be discussing what executive functions are, how challenges with executive functions manifest in children and adults with ADHD, but most important of all, we'll bust a laziness myth. As usual, before we jump into our conversation with Mackenzie, here's a bit more about her. With a lifelong commitment to behavioral health, Mackenzie is a professional and empathetic PA-C with experience in medical management, telemedicine, CBT, and lifestyle changes. Her education includes a Master's of Medical Science from Mercer University with a focus on physician assistant studies, including an addiction management rotation and special lectures on LGBTQ safe medicine. As a former patient advocate and MA at a non-profit clinic, she understands the importance of serving underserved populations. Mackenzie, welcome back to Thriving with ADHD. I am delighted to have you back. This time we are talking about ADHD and executive functions. I'd say we are back to basics, and I'm really excited to tackle this topic with you.
Yeah, I'm excited too. This is a pretty good one that a lot of patients bring up, so I think it's going to be really relevant. Yeah.
All right, so let's get to it. So, can you explain what executive functions are and how they are impacted by ADHD?
Yeah, so executive functions are once again kind of a loose term when we use it in the context of ADHD, I believe. I mean, if you look up the exact definition, like on Wikipedia or something. It's very much a neuropsychology term. It's included in brain functions. So other brain functions would be like arousal, attention, consciousness, decision making. Executive functions is just kind of a category of brain functions in neuropsychology. And they're a set of cognitive processes that are necessary for cognitive control of behavior, which is kind of like a very broad term, as you could imagine. But executive functions include basic cognitive things like attention control, inhibition control, memory, working memory, cognitive flexibility. But often when my patients are seeing me and we're, maybe doing like a screening for ADHD or maybe even autism, we start discussing executive functions. Yeah. And they'll say, my executive function's just really low. And because it's such a broad term, I always have to ask them, can you explain that more to me?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? And oftentimes they'll say, well, it's really hard for me to prioritize things, or, I can't keep anything clean or organized, or, I save things to the very last minute. And all those answers are correct. But it's just important to ask your patient what they mean by executive functions. But anything, that it involves inhibition control, cognitive control, attention control, or flexibility, memory, that's going to be included in the umbrella of executive functions.
Okay, so let's talk more about the challenges with executive functions and how they manifest both in children and adults with ADHD.
So I think it's going to be very different for children at times. And I think that's very much seen in ADHD, because I'll have my patients who are sometimes coming for an ADHD evaluation for the first time, explain to me that their ADHD was completely missed as a kid. And those are usually our inattentive type adults. They weren't super hyper, right? They had inhibition control. They were able to get good grades or turn their homework at the very last minute. So they have probably a very different look about them when it comes to executive functions as someone whose ADHD was caught, whether it was an attentive type or hyperactive type. The
Mm-hmm.
hyperactive type is probably going to have less inhibition control. They were probably in trouble a lot as kids, and getting in trouble in the classroom enough, especially if it was affecting your ability to make good grades, I think is going to be a red flag much earlier in life. And maybe your ADHD was caught when you were a kid, and maybe you were treated for it, or maybe it was just, maybe it was just diagnosed. But based on your different executive function deficits, I think that that's going to impact your childhood very differently. And as an adult, I think it's going to start impacting you when your environment is more chaotic, when your environment is demanding more executive function control for you. I think that you are going to start to struggle in some sort of setting, whether it's relationships or college or a job. That's when the red flag is going to pop up, when suddenly your executive function is holding you back. Those deficits are holding you back from succeeding, and then they make an appointment with us. So, really depends on the patient to answer your question specifically, but I think it's always interesting to look at childhood and say, when did these executive function deficits start impacting your ability to succeed? Because that's when we're going to start wondering if someone may have ADHD.
Mm.
Yeah.
And what are some strategies or interventions that can help improve executing functioning skills in people with ADHD and
Absolutely.
children,
I
of
think
course?
the
Children and adults,
yes,
I'd say.
children and adults. Yeah, I
Mhm.
I only treat adults. I have some experience in, a pediatric
Mhm.
rotation. So
Mhm.
basically 6 weeks pediatric and kind
Mhm.
of, learning a lot about ADHD there. I've never treated kids. I treat teens, 18 and over, but
Mhm.
one thing I think is really important, and I think, a kid could do this too based on their age. I think it would be really hard to assess maybe a 5-year-old at this, but they're a little bit older, maybe, 9 and above. They may be able to take assessment that I
Mhm.
know of. It's
Mhm.
it's very unofficial. It's called Executive Skills Questionnaire.
Mhm.
It's nothing that's it's not in the DSM-5 or anything special like
Mhm.
that, but it is a really good handout that I have for my patients that breaks executive functions down into sections.
Mhm.
So I believe there's, section A through L, so several sections, and what it breaks it down into is response inhibition, working memory, emotional control, task initiation, sustained attention, planning and prioritization, organization, time management, flexibility, metacognition, goal direction, persistence, and stress tolerance. So that's a really good way to take executive skills, which is a very broad topic, and maybe just break it down for
Mhm.
patients. And when you take this assessment, it kind of figures out what your, top three strengths are going to be, because, you're not going to be weak in all of these. And
Mhm.
then you've got your executive skill challenges, the things that you really struggle with. And based on your scoring, I think it's a lot easier for me as a provider to say, okay, these top 3 to 4 challenges are going to be where we need to see improvement. And I took it. I took it just for the sake of having this conversation this morning. And I kind of
Mhm.
knew what mine would be. And my challenges are task initiation. So I will definitely wait until the last second to do something. And I've always been that way. And I think a lot of ADHDers are too. Organization and planning and prioritization. But my top strength is flexibility.
Mhm.
So I think that knowing your patient's strengths, you can use those to
Mhm.
to fix your challenges. So I'll have a conversation with the patient, and if I were the patient, I would probably say, well, your best skill, your best strength is going to be flexibility. How can we use flexibility to fix your task initiation? So I could say to myself, if I wait until the last second to do something, I keep putting it off, I'll do it later, I'll do it later. Why can't I just be more flexible with myself and say, well, we could wait and to the very last second and do it later, but why don't we just do it now? If somebody else came up to me and said, "Hey, Mackenzie, can you do this for me now?" I'd be like, "No problem. Let me just do it for you now." So kind of psyching yourself out of your ability to put something off until the last second definitely takes practice, but it would be different for each patient. But I think this handout's a really great way of really honing in on how we can make some of these challenges better using your strengths. I don't know if maybe I can even make this. This is a free handout. We can maybe I can send it to you and we can maybe include it in the podcast description or something. But
Of course.
that's what I use. Yeah, that's what I use. And once you can identify the challenges, you can also look for specific tools like organization. There's so many tools for organization. We can find books about it, TV shows about it. We can find all sorts of materials online. I think the challenge is really knowing which skill you need to improve on and going from there. Yeah.
Hmm. So to summarize,
Mhm.
learn your strengths and learn your challenges, and
Mhm.
use the strengths to help your challenges. And this is
Yeah.
why it's good to get tested to know, to exactly define. So yes, you're right. When you say executive functions, it's very broad. I
Yeah.
I myself wouldn't know where to start, but when you explain those nicely and divide them into meaningful things that can help us, that it makes a lot more sense. So, and also you're
Yeah.
very kind to lead us through your own example. So that was very kind and generous of you. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll move on to the next question, and let's talk about stigma. So, um, it's big around
Yeah.
ADHD. So, how
Yep.
do we approach the stigma surrounding the condition and encourage a more supportive environment for individuals with ADHD?
I think that especially when it comes to executive function, the
Mhm.
first stigma I think about is laziness, right?
Mm,
You're lazy, and
mm,
I don't know if I'm wrong in this, but I guess because I work in psychiatry, I don't really believe in laziness. I think that there is a root cause for why people are not doing the things that they should be doing, but especially when I've got a patient that makes promises to themselves, right?
mm,
And they want to do things. They want to take care of themselves. They want to show up at work. They want to show up at school, but they just can't. That to me is not laziness. If you've got a desire to do these things, it doesn't make any sense that you wouldn't do them. Maybe there's somebody out there that has no desire to do anything, and maybe that would be lazy, but I've never seen it. So
mhm,
I think that is definitely the stigma. And even patients will stigmatize themselves and say, "I'm lazy," right?
mhm,
I don't know why I can't just do these things and be like everybody else, and I'm lazy. And I think one of the most important things is to just get rid of that word
mhm,
and be able to label it for what it really is. So that I approach that by having a conversation with my patients about how laziness isn't real, even if it's something else. Maybe it's not ADHD, maybe it's depression, maybe it's
mm,
anxiety, but there's always something underlying there, and I try to encourage a more supportive environment by just dismissing laziness, right? And let's figure out where your executive function deficits actually are, and then we'll prove it. We'll prove that you're not lazy once we're able
mm,
to undo some of these things and get treatment, the medication. If somebody's using medication, that works wonders too. So that helps patients realize that those stigmas are about them are not real as well. So
mhm.
treatment is very important. Yeah.
Um, I'd like to ask, is there anything that people can do to how to say, set up their environment, but also can they rely on family or friends? So whenever whoever it is they trust to support them in this journey of managing the condition.
Yeah,
What are your
yeah. And
thoughts?
I
Yeah.
think some of my patients have, parents or family or especially significant others that are very understanding.
Mm, mm,
Sometimes not, sometimes not, especially my patients that have not had ADHD their whole lives and or they haven't had the diagnosis. Of course, they've had it their whole life, but they
yeah.
haven't had the diagnosis with them their whole life. So they may have been labeled lazy. Their parents may not have understood
Mm,
ADHD. They may not have really been on board with any sort of mental illness support.
mm,
Some of that's generational, some of it's cultural, who knows? But
mhm,
it's really hard for my patients to break through that sometimes. And I just encourage them to find, if you can't find support within, your family or your coworkers, or you feel like nobody understands you because you just happen to not really have anybody else in your life that gets what you're going through, you got to find it. We've got to find it, right? So
mhm,
there's all sorts of support groups out there. I don't remember some of them off the top of my head. I know there's Emotions Anonymous is one of the most famous ones, but that one's not specific to ADHD. But showing up for, like we provide the meetup, we provide this podcast. Finding your people is really
mm,
important in this, and in creating
yeah.
a community of people that understand you. I think that's also going to fight the stigma, right? See, it's not just me. It's not just me that
Yeah.
struggles
Yeah.
with this. And you
Yeah.
may never get people who don't understand on board, and that's
Yeah.
okay. I think what's really important is that you understand, your own, mental health journey, whatever that may be, and you understand your own
Yeah.
challenges and your skills. I
Yeah.
think that one thing we really forget about Nada is that ADHD comes with a large set of skills
Mm-hmm.
that are unique. One example is many of my patients are very creative. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a very common comorbidity, if you will, in ADHD. And oftentimes some of my patients will even say, we need to find a medication that doesn't take away my creativity, but will treat my ADHD at the same time. And I think that's a great goal. That's really important.
Yeah.
So it does come with good skill. I also think it's a skill to be able to wait until the last 5 minutes to write a paper and
Great.
knock it out and get an A. That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But can we make it so that life is easier for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can we make it so that you're not, feeling like you're lazy or letting people down all the time? And
Yeah.
yeah. So there are many things you can do to set up your environment to
Yeah.
be more supportive of
Yeah.
your challenges, and even more supportive of your strengths. But it kind of comes down to the person. And I think you really brought up a great point, is even if you don't inherently have that support system,
Mm-hmm.
we got to find it, and we
Yeah.
have lots of resources to
Yeah.
find that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And are there any recent developments or research findings in the field of ADHD and executive functioning that offer hope and new directions for treatment and understanding? So I suppose there is no medication that will keep your creativity, but maybe there is something else out there that sounds good.
Mm, I mean, I think that not all medications will wipe out people's creativity or
Yeah.
or their strengths as it
Yeah.
as it as it applies to ADHD. Some of my patients do have that experience, but normally just changing the medicine is good.
Hmm.
And I think, medication does help. As far as research, it's tough because executive function isn't really a something that we can measure very well. So
Mm.
it's not something that I found much research on. But I think one really interesting thing that I did come across is they're more able to map where this is happening in the brain through research right now, through neuropsychology research. Um, One really famous case study that you come across many times in psychology classes or psychiatry classes, is the case of Phineas Gage. Many people, know about that one. It's kind of famous and way back in the day, 1800s or something like that. I wish I had it pulled up in front of me so I could tell you the exact date, but long before we had any sort of brain imaging technology, there was an individual who suffered a very famous injury where like this pipe went through the front of his head and he
Mm-hmm.
lived and he was totally fine. And yes, they removed it eventually, but it taught us so much about the brain. You
Mm-hmm.
can live impairing certain parts of the brain. Now, other parts you cannot. And I believe the part of his brain that was impaled was the frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex. So the frontal lobes are what controls many personality
Mm-hmm.
traits. And we know people who have damage to their frontal lobe, their personality can completely change. Um, but we don't often run experiments on these things, right? You can't just
Mm-hmm.
induce damage in a brain and see what happens in a human. So we have to wait for unique opportunities like Phineas Gage to study these things. And they are doing more imaging and things like that, on patients in research settings. And it's very obvious that executive function is mostly
Mm-hmm.
controlled within the prefrontal cortex. And that's why we know addiction can also make a lot of cognitive impulse control can really go down the tube when you have an addiction, right? And that's due to changes made in the prefrontal cortex. And that is an executive function category, is inhibition
Mm.
control. So um, as it applies to ADHD, I think we know about dopamine, we know about
Mm-hmm.
norepinephrine, and that there's an imbalance and normally a deficit when it comes to ADHD, but knowing where these things are in the brain is important too. So I don't know where that will lead us eventually. It would be interesting to see how this changes over time. I think about things like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation therapy that we use for depression and OCD that map, because we can map in the brain where we need improvements in activity for
Mm-hmm.
these things, we can use this helmet that sends, stimulation through magnets to certain areas of the brain. What if one day we could use that to just, make changes to the prefrontal cortex?
Mm.
And suddenly we've got a non-medication option for ADHD. I mean, that's my creative imagination, but I think there will be improvements like that and where we can map these things out and know where they come from. Yeah.
Absolutely. Sounds like a possibility to me. So,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
I'm with you 100%. So, let's wrap it up.
yeah,
As always, if there is one most important thing, words of encouragement, anything that you would like our listeners to remember from everything we talked about, what that would be.
yeah. So you're not lazy. That would definitely be my takeaway as it relates to this episode.
Mm.
You've got to figure out what your strengths are, your skills, and use that to fight the challenges you have in executive function because these challenges are probably what makes ADHD so hard to live with in the real world, right? As it applies to jobs and school and keeping promises to yourself and taking care of yourself. These are some of the most important things that we can make changes to with ADHD treatment because it's going to change somebody's life. I think, it's really going to change the trajectory of your life. And I would encourage patients to use tools like the screener I talked about to figure out what their strengths and challenges may be and know that they're changeable. They're changeable. It may take a long time to figure out, what behaviors we need to change and how and what's going to work best for you as an individual, but you're not stuck. You're not stuck, with making these mistakes or being this way forever, but this comes with strengths too, and we can utilize those. Not everything in ADHD is a problem, not everything is a deficit. Find your strengths, find what you're really good at because of ADHD, and we can use that to improve the quality of your life, right?
Awesome. That's just brilliant. I suppose, as we often like to say, you're more than your condition. You're
Yeah.
not.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah,
Yep.
this was brilliant. Thank you so much. You made things clearer, I'd say, and hopefully helped people listening to this and encourage them. Encourage
I hope
them.
so.
Yeah. Thanks again. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope to have you again soon to talk about some other exciting topic regarding ADHD.
Thank you so much, Nada. I really appreciate coming on. I love doing these. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Thriving with ADHD. This show is produced by Animo Sano Psychiatry. Please follow, rate, or share our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other streaming app of your choice. Music is by Daddy's Music from Pixabay. For more information about Animo Sano Psychiatry, please visit animosanopsychiatry.com.